Thanks for watching our video. Make sure to subscribe to the Old Stone Church YouTube channel.
Wonder what it was that made Jesus quite that upset when he walked into the temple space. We tend to think of Jesus as a kind of holier-than-thou figure, but he kind of has a flip-out moment. And I can't imagine the looks on your faces if I were to walk in here on a Sunday and just start flipping things over, the communion table, the Alpha and Omega here on the pulpit, and just slam it off of there. Now you're all sitting here in your Sunday best, and the preacher up here flipping out. I can't even imagine the looks on your faces. These ancient Judean Jews of yesteryear, they were most probably doing something that was very normal for them. Animals were needed for the Passover sacrifice. I don't know the tradition of how they began selling them in or near the temple. I can only ask you to imagine coming into this fine sanctuary, this house of God, and imagining all the pews removed, imagining cows and sheep and goats and doves being sold right in this very room. Maybe this communion table flipped over would serve as a feeding space for cattle. Maybe our wonderful baptistry could be used as a separate place for the 1-year-old lambs, those 1-year-old lambs being significant to the ancient Judean Jewish custom for a Passover sacrifice. And tables set up in our narthex out by the street entrance where the money changers from the many nations of the people who made the long journey to Jerusalem for Passover. Friends, let's go back in time just a minute. Let's picture Old Stone Church as the Jerusalem temple of this Ohio area. People would come from miles around walking with their animals to sell. The goal in this selling of what they had, sometimes these older animals or anything they brought with them, the goal was to acquire a 1-year-old lamb needed for the Passover sacrifice. If all were to come here for Passover, it would be the equivalent of people from Akron having Akron money, and people from Medina a different type of currency, and people from Bay Village their own type of currency. People from the east up in the heights bringing their own kind of money. And someone or some peoples at tables had to sit down and make some sense out of this complete and utter nonsense of the different currencies. And my guess is that Jesus' anger came from maybe some kind of corruption, or maybe some potential overcharging for these animals, or charging interest, which was not allowed. Or maybe there were loans or deals going under the table for some prominent families to get their lamb first. I have no idea truly why Jesus was so freaked out. An ancient Judean Jewish custom had some major differences from the rabbinical Judaism that we know today. And I won't cover all of those. The major one, though, is that the temple, the Jerusalem temple, was a place that people made a trek to from their homes. People from many nations traveled very far and wide to get to the Jerusalem temple for Passover. Now, in modern rabbinical Judaism of today, the local synagogue is where people worship, and Passover, the Seder, centers around family in their very homes. If you are interested in any way in what a modern-day Passover Seder looks like, friends, we have been invited as a congregation to Anshe Chesed Fairmont Temple in Beechwood on March 14th. I believe it's a Wednesday evening. We have room for about 30 people. If this is of interest to you, get in touch with me sometime after today and before Wednesday, and we'll get you on that list. So exactly what is it that made Jesus so angry? a big part of me loves this scripture because it is one of Jesus' most human moments. He shows us a bit of rage or anger in the flipping over of these money tables that were defiling his Father's house, the temple. Its foundation is not only religious, but political. And I know there is that word that we just don't want to hear sometimes in church, political. Well, we have a kind of conundrum here, folks. The entire foundation of this specific scripture of Jesus and the entire foundation of the exile of the Jews that the Passover represented is rooted in an overarching political conversation. I am not exactly sure how to be a person of faith walking with a Jesus who had to carry his own cross, the cross being the ultimate symbol of a political death. I am not exactly sure how to be a person of faith without a sense of trying to deeply understand the political context in which Jesus lived and in which he ministered. Taking in the entire context of Scripture is part of the process of being able to understand Jesus' full humanity. And politics was a very real part of Jesus' everyday life. Friends, when I think of fully human, I often think of my own youth. I think of the privilege of how free I felt at a very young age, the privilege of taking on new things and paving some new paths in my life, music being one of them. I think of the privilege of doors that were open to me and doors that were open for me. But that youthful bliss changed at the age of 17 when I experienced the death of a young person in my life. A friend of mine, Matthew, drowned at a beach in the state of Iowa when I was 17, and I happened to have been there that day, but I showed up just a little bit too late as the chaos of the recovery and emergency that happens when someone drowned had already begun and almost ended. Experiencing one of my first broken spirit and broken heart moments of life, I lost my relationship with God for many, many years because of that very day. It was a challenging and tragic situation for those of us young people who were on the beach that day, his classmates and his friends. And that day makes me think of our young people in Florida, speaking out for what they believe about the traumas they have experienced recently. I hear the constant question of why politics in the church? Why does church have to be political? And friends, the truth is we don't. We can come together and we can talk about the dogma of religion. We can talk about the tenets of the Reformed tradition. We could keep it pretty base and we could keep it fairly tame. And I don't necessarily think there is anything wrong with that, except for that sometimes there is. Because I think the good Lord requires just a bit more of that from each of us. Jesus' flip out in the temple is actually a good example of that. In fact, the other three Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in those Gospels, Jesus flipping over the money changers' tables was one of the political straws that broke the camel's back of what would get him crucified. In those Gospels, the story occurs much later in the narrative, right before the time of our Good Friday. The crucifixion, friends, was the way the criminals died. Crucifixion was the quieting of voices that spoke out publicly in deference to empire and to the status quo of the time. There wasn't a great separation of the temple from the goings-on of politics during Jesus' time. There just was not this separation. Today we read this scripture from a very different context, from a context far outside of what really was happening in ancient Judea. In Beechwood in 2 weeks, friends, there will be no cows, there will be no sheep or doves at the Fairmont Temple Seder. But there will be the constant reminder of the exodus of a people from slavery. And why should we care about this exodus? Because Jesus was Jewish, and even to this day, the exodus is central to Judaism and to our Good Friday message. To know Jesus' full humanness, we have to push a bit deeper into his context. His context was Judaism, and Jesus' response to reform was seen as extremely threatening. When I think of being fully human, I sometimes can't sleep at night thinking of the ways in which people have attempted to hush these young people in Florida. They have the right to speak in public, just as I do at this very minute in front of you. Some of them have had their lives threatened because of their public speaking about the gun violence and deaths that they have personally experienced. What is so wrong with our world that the truths of young people is sending shivering fear through some grown people? That someone would further threaten the lives of these young people after they have already been through such a tragedy of losing so many friends? The sad part of this is that these are not the first group of people to be threatened for using their voice in our world. We know the groups who have been threatened. We know the groups who, some of which have lost their lives for using the very voice that I am allowed privilege to use here at this pulpit. Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ community, veterans coming home from war and never having enough, even to this day. Friends, these young people flipping over the money tables is their own personal temple of their own bodies. These young people are telling the world that we have enough money changers in it already. We are full up on the money changing and empire-sized institutions, empires that use their dollar power to collect interest and to tell people to do it their way or to shut up. These young people are responding from a fully human and vulnerable space. They are responding from broken hearts outward to a fear, instead of living in that fear and propelling it further. And some in this world are threatened by that and want them hushed. There was this other person that people wanted hushed. After his honesties in public, after his moment of truth flipping tables in the temple, after his healings and his telling of the good news of God to those that might hear it, after his sitting at table with folks from all walks of life, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the sick, the weak, the hungry, as Jesus got closer to his end and closer to some universal truths, so many people disappeared in support of him. It was just easier to hide or to go back to the ways of the ancient Jews and to kind of tuck in, to remain in that fear. If you ask me, one of the reasons why church is in decline is because of our refusal to accept that Jesus was just as fully human as we all are. We refuse to allow our whole selves to come to God and to trust that God can handle all that we bring to this table. Surely God couldn't understand the depths of our humanness. Surely God couldn't understand our illnesses, our shortcomings, our addiction. Surely God couldn't handle the guilt that we carry. Surely God couldn't handle the lie or two that we told in our life. Surely God couldn't handle the tension in our families, in our jobs, in our churches. Surely God couldn't handle the fear being constantly poured out in our nation, or the cries of young people to quench it. Could she? Can God handle our full humanness, our full humanity, all that we are? Is that what we really want these young people in Florida to do, to shut up? Oh, these young people, they couldn't possibly be speaking with any kind of authority, could they, after watching 17 of their friends die? What could they know being so young, right? I mean, friends, there are countless times in Scripture where people wanted Jesus just to be silenced. Countless times where his very authority was questioned. That boy from Nazareth, what could he possibly know? Wasn't he the son of a simple carpenter? Even his own family was afraid that he might be crazy or had some kind of demon. Even the people closest to him will desert him. All of them will disappear when he needs them most. I invite you to join us here on Maundy, Thursday, and on Good Friday, that we might not desert Jesus, that we might spend some time sitting with him through the toughest time of our church history. You think church is in decline now? Can you even in any way imagine how alone church must have felt in the temple of Jesus' very own body, carrying that heavy cross, fully alone? We might begin by asking ourselves, how human a Jesus are we comfortable with? Is there something about Jesus' full humanness that makes it challenging for us in our own humanity? There was one person who knew what it was like to stand up for something, for the better of all people, and to have one's life constantly threatened. There was one person who knew well the Psalm 51 Ash Wednesday scripture, that the only sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, not animals sold by money changers. As children of God, we don't shut people up when they are speaking from this broken spirit space. We walk with them. We acknowledge their brokenness, and we listen. We listen like Jesus was such an expert at doing. Seek the humanity in Jesus that we might more closely seek the divine in our very own selves. Friends, I have seen it. I know you. I talk to you about your faith. We have people right here with full stories. We have people right here in this sanctuary with broken hearts and broken spirits and voices out of those places doing the good work of God out in our world. I talk to you about the great ideas that you have for this church to move toward a new heaven and a new earth right here, right now in the greater Cleveland area. We are a church called to being life changers. We are a church called to being game changers in our world. There are plenty of money changers. The world is full up on the money changing. Empires that want us to just shut up about God's true love for all people. The world is full up on fear. The world is full up on those that charge interest. The world is full up on the mixing of message and the confusion. What the world will never be full of, what the world will never be full up on, is the love of God. Yes, Jesus had to flip a table once in a while to be heard. Maybe, just maybe, like those young people in Florida, here and there, every once in a while, we are going to need to flip a few tables too.
Thanks for watching our video. Make sure to subscribe to get the latest and greatest videos from the Old Stone Church. And if you feel blessed by our message, please go to theoldstonechurch.org and click Donate. God bless you today and forever. The Old Stone Church. We've been loving Christ and serving City since 1820.